Hey Internet. When someone claims to be offended by something completely innocuous, a lot of people assume that the best and based response to their manufactured outrage is to simply say, "So what if you're offended? Who cares?" And while this type of response appears on the surface to work, in the long term it actually doesn't. So in this video I will be explaining why that is, as well as going over a much better response. And that reason is because most of the time, the person you're dealing with isn't actually offended. This is because most of these individuals are in fact what you can call a grievance grifter, which is a person who pretends to be offended by something, when in reality they have an ulterior motive and do not truly possess any genuine feelings on the matter. And this motive could be a lot of different things. For instance, the most common one is for clout and prestige seeking by signaling that they have the correct opinions trademark by dumpstering on someone else for stepping out of line. Or it could also be a personal vendetta against the person that they are accusing of being offensive. Or it could even be for some weird psychological reason like the need to feel powerful, and so they figure by harassing someone over allegedly offensive takes, they can live out said fantasy. It could also be for political gain, or it could even be for financial gain, such as the case with professional victims, who basically take this grift to its maximum conclusion and try to make a full-blown career out of digging out grievances. Whatever the reason they have, the basic issue is the same. These people are completely fake. The grievance grifter is lying to you. They are not actually offended by what they claim to be offensive. And this is unfortunately a very effective grift, because it's impossible to empirically, objectively prove whether or not someone finds something genuinely offensive. For instance, I could claim that people who still wear Crocs in the year 2023 are the most offensive thing in the world to me, and that every time I see someone wearing a pair, I feel a psychological pain so great that it is like being thrown into the sun a million times over. While this would be mostly ridiculous, technically, no one can prove me wrong. And that's exactly what the grievance grifter is taking advantage of. They can never be proven 100% fraudulent, because their claim is completely subjective. But there is still a decent way to fight back, because there is a method that can be used to at the very least prove that they are most likely being fraudulent. And to demonstrate what that is, I shall explain by using the Adam Sessler drama that recently went down earlier this month as an example. Adam Sessler used to be the main host of a gaming show called X-Play back on G4 TV in the early 2000s. Considering the time, wokery was a lot less restrictive, and so mainstream TV could get away with a lot more politically incorrect content. Fast forward to Clown World, year 2023, and we get this here tweet, which I have blurred out their name both because I don't want to give them any additional attention or clout, or encourage any harassment against them. And on a side note, yes, I am aware that Adam Sessler made a response to this tweet. Yes, his response was incredibly dumb and short-sighted, but that's not the point of this video. Anyways, the tweet reads, "The racism towards Japan on G4 and X-Play was actually so much worse than you know." And I'll just show a quick clip of this video showing the alleged offensive bigotry.
It is time of game!
It's X-Play!
Morgan-san!
Adam-san!
Welcome to Shad Baby Shack! Follow me as I follow Shad through the streets of Tokyo, Japan. I'm your noble translator, Extreme Kevin!
Hello, it is I, Shad Gravy, your astral navigator through the archipelagos of Hypnotica when health is low.
そうです。面白いキャラクターがいっぱい登場します。
Canada Man!
We
インターン
Duncan Link!
Zelda!
Shad No Eric!
Assault Panda!
Many great characters!
Yeah, now most rational people can tell that this is almost certainly fake outrage. But how do you really know? The answer is doing a bit of quick research and then applying some basic Occam's razor, where the answer that requires the fewest assumptions is usually the correct one. First off, the person who originally made this tweet has Japanese in the description complete with some random anime references on their profile. From this we can assume that this person should at least be a little bit familiar with Japanese culture and history. So let's do a brief history lesson on Japanese television in the 1990s, and I'll just show a few clips in the background. Notice anything familiar here? The truth is that this kind of lol random and intentionally absurd tacky humor that X-Play was mimicking was in fact a staple of many old Japanese game shows. In fact, if you were to take these old shows and clip them with X-Play's allegedly offensive video, you would have a hard time telling the difference. This means that X-Play wasn't really being inaccurate, and thus what Adam was doing should be more accurately seen as an homage rather than any kind of intentional hostility. X-Play isn't trying to make fun or mock Japanese television, rather they are just partaking in a certain style of Japanese television that actually did exist. Which leaves the only real thing in the clip from the tweet that went viral that can be called out by the grievance industry here is really just the fact that Adam is white and not Asian. In other words, this is an example of the dreaded cultural appropriation. Which for this I will just give the Wikipedia definition since their bias actually works in my favor for this one. Cultural appropriation is the inappropriate or unacknowledged adoption of an element or elements of one cultural identity by members of another cultural identity. This can be especially controversial when members of a dominant culture appropriate from minority cultures. And then it goes on to say that this appropriation is a form of colonialism. Now, the general issue with cultural appropriation is that it logically requires you to believe in collective guilt if you are going to push the angle that any person of one race partaking in another culture is guilty of colonialism just by virtue of being the wrong race or the privileged race, which again are just more examples of collective guilt, which is an obviously stupid and racist argument in itself, which is why some of the smarter woketoids actually have walked back on whining about cultural appropriation. In fact, many of the leftists and breadtubers I've watched don't really complain about cultural appropriation anymore because they've realized that it's kind of a losing battle for them. It's pretty easy to see why cultural appropriation is a completely fake outrage. No one's actually offended by it. It was completely manufactured. Nobody can possibly own the intellectual property of an entire culture, and you certainly can't own it just based on what your race is, so it's a completely ridiculous concept. But what's especially ridiculous in this case is that this is Japan we are talking about. Cultural appropriation is a product of manufactured outrage that is largely unique to the cathedral of Western progressive ideology. If you actually go to Japan and ask Japanese people on the streets in Japan about how they feel when they see a foreigner partaking in their culture, Japanese people actually get confused because not only do they not find this sort of thing offensive at all, they actually have a hard time understanding why they should even find it offensive. Because, again, cultural appropriation is fake. And yes, this has actually been done before. There are several videos where a person goes around the streets of Tokyo asking Japanese people how they feel about cultural appropriation, and those videos are absolute gold because they expose just how fake the concept is, as it shows how a population which has not been heavily exposed to woke brainwashing like the West has find the idea of appropriation completely ridiculous, leading them to say things like, the person who was talking about Japanese cultural appropriation like that was probably not really a Japanese person. Oof. So not only are these people not offended by cultural appropriation, but the concept itself is, ironically, foreign to them. Now let's go back to the tweet and start applying Occam's razor to whether or not this person is truly offended. This person is supposedly a fan of Japanese culture, and yet we must assume that they somehow don't know that this video was a relatively accurate homage to the wacky style of television shows from Japan during the 1990s, which is odd because they have knowledge of X-Play from the early 2000s. So we must assume that they did zero research in one direction, but a lot of research in another direction before calling it offensive. And we must also assume that they don't know that Japanese people in general are not really offended by cultural appropriation and have a hard time even understanding why they should feel offended by it. And again, assume they did no research into how people on the streets of Tokyo actually react to this. We also must assume that the people claiming to be offended by this have genuinely interpreted this X-Play clip in no other way, which then opens up even more assumptions that we must make, because one element of woketoids claiming to be offended at every insignificant thing that I have noticed is that they almost always have a bad faith element involved in their interpretation. If an allegedly offensive piece of media has 100 different ways it can be interpreted, and only one of them is offensive, the grievance police will always latch onto that one offensive interpretation, regardless of how likely it is to be correct. We must assume that these people genuinely reach the negative conclusion completely organically, despite all the logical and factual errors with that conclusion. On the other hand, we can just assume that this person, as well as the other people who are dogpiling on it for clout, are lying to you. They do not actually believe that this clip from X-Play was racist. Nobody is genuinely offended by it. Thus, by Occam's razor, it is far more likely that this is all a grift. And this is why the response, "I don't care if you are offended," does not work in the long run. When you say this, you are accidentally conceding to them that they are indeed offended, which is exactly what they want. The grievance grifter does not truly care about fixing whatever grievance they claim to have, because again, they do not truly have said grievance. Rather, their goal is whatever ulterior motive motive lies behind their grift, which in this case I am guessing is probably just clout. But it's not always clout, and sometimes it can get a lot darker. For instance, when that motive is a political one, the Grievance Grifters ultimately want to push for more censorship on the internet, and of course more censorship in real life as well. And yes, a huge portion of these people also want to eventually dismantle the First Amendment of the United States, with the goal being universal censorship of whatever those in charge deem to be offensive content. Trademark. Spoiler alert, this power would be heavily abused by the state, and I have a bridge to sell anyone who disagrees with that. This isn't a conspiracy theory, this is just what the majority of wokes admit to believing when asked in a survey. There is no mask to unmask here. This has openly been their strategy for a long time now. So when you say LOL who cares in the face of one of these people bringing up a manufactured grievance, while that may seem like a based way to blow them off, it really only works in the short term. The Grievance Grifter will be back another day with another grift. So then, what is the superior response to these people? Well, that is to simply call them out on their grift. When you see one of these people intentionally interpreting something in bad faith to falsely paint it as offensive, first consider Occam's razor, and if you can think of a far more plausible and more innocent interpretation for whatever their grievance is, then instead of saying, "Who cares if you're offended?" just flat out accuse them of lying. "You are not actually offended" is thus the better way. And this is a much stronger position to take because the grifter will absolutely push back on it. You will likely have to point out the alternative interpretations and then defend why it should be obvious to any rational human being that that interpretation is the correct one. The goal here is to shift the discussion away from the unfalsifiable claim of being offended by countering it with that they are lying and not truly offended. This will shift the discussion to which interpretation is more likely and put the grifter in a defensive position where they are either forced to admit that their interpretation of what they claim to be offended by was wrong, or double down and continue to make a complete fool of themselves. Both of these end in their loss if it indeed is a grievance grifter. Although I should make something absolutely clear, you should only do this if you are completely certain that they are a grievance grifter. Do not try this tactic if you are not willing to defend it, or if you suspect there is a decent chance that they truly are offended, because while calling them out on their grift is much better than the Sigma male LOL who cares, turn 360 degrees and moonwalk away move, it does take a lot more effort to successfully pull off. I mean, you could, if you wanted to, pull the Chad move of simply showing up, stating the truth, which is that they're a grifter, and then leaving, and refusing to elaborate, but you should tread carefully and don't enter battles that you aren't confident in or don't really care about. And make sure to never use this as an excuse or tactic to genuinely harass anyone. That would just make you seem like a complete fool. I absolutely do not condone this method being used in bad faith. Anyways, that's all for today. If you enjoyed the video, feel free to like, subscribe, and all that. Until next time.